Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're going to continue our lesson today on genetics, okay? Today, we're mostly focusing on some vocabulary terms. Some of these we've already seen, some of them we haven't seen yet, okay? At the end of this lecture, though, I've got a review worksheet with all of these vocabulary terms on there, okay? So make sure you're following along. Give me your attention the best you can, and that way when we get to that worksheet at the end of this lesson, you'll know what's going on and it won't give you any problem at all, okay? So again, we're just gonna introduce some vocabulary. Some of this stuff can be kind of tricky, and if you don't have the language under your belt, it makes it even harder. So we're just gonna go ahead, talk about some important terms that you need to know before we continue and talk about more complicated stuff. Okay, so here are some vocabulary terms that you want to be aware of as this lesson progresses. Okay, so number one, we're going to talk about something called a trait. What is a trait? This is a characteristic that an organism can pass on to its offspring through its genes. A trait is something you can see. So this could be the color of your hair or the color of your eyes, or are you right-handed or left-handed? Those are all traits, okay? It's just something about you, okay? The next term I wanted to talk about here is heredity, okay? Heredity is the transmission of traits from parent to offspring. So we know if you look at yourself and compare yourself to your parents, you probably have some things in common with them. You might have your mom's eyes or your dad's hair, okay? They're passing on their genes to you, and that's called heredity, okay? So then the next term is genetics, and this is the scientific study of heredity, okay? It's kind of putting it, studying it, doing what Gregor Mendel did, doing experiments and seeing if you can kind of wrap your head around it a little bit better. That's what genetics is studying heredity. Okay, let's keep this going. Okay, another term we need to know about is a purebred. Okay, a lot of times you'll see this word in conjunction when they're talking about either a horse or a dog. Okay, a purebred is an organism that consistently produces offspring with the same form of a trait as the parent. Offsprings are usually homozygous dominant or recessive, which means they have two alleles that are the same for a particular trait. And that means when they reproduce, you can be certain what type of traits they're passing on. Okay, here's our next vocabulary term. It's just gene. What is a gene? A gene is a segment of DNA on a chromosome that encodes for a specific trait. Okay, so kind of look at the picture of this chromosome next to the dog. You see how the chromosome is mostly blue, but it has those bands that are different colors. Some of the bands are yellow or some of the bands are green or orange. Okay, so those bands would represent a gene. It's a small part of the DNA that codes for a specific trait. So one of these bands might be saying this person's going to have red hair, or one of those bands might be saying this person's going to be tall. Okay, that's kind of how it works. So on the DNA, there's specific segments of the DNA that code for a trait, and we call those genes. Okay, here's our next term is allele. What is an allele? An allele is the different versions of a gene. Okay, so when it comes to humans, okay, there's a lot of different examples of these, but let me just give you one. So with humans, you can have blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, right? Those are all alleles. They're different versions of a gene, okay? And so when we're saying this person is homozygous or heterozygous, let's take heterozygous as an example, you might be capital B, lowercase b. Well, that means you have two different alleles for the same trait, because the capital and the lowercase letter are coding for different things. So alleles, I kind of just think of them as different flavors. So like you got ice cream, you can have chocolate ice cream, you can have vanilla ice cream. They're different flavors, but they're the same thing. They're both ice cream. That's kind of what an allele is. It's different versions of a thing. Okay, let's keep it going. Okay, we're about halfway through these. All right, number 7 is the dominant allele. Remember that a dominant allele is an allele whose trait is expressed in the organism whenever it is present. So if you have a capital letter, it's going to show. Okay, it's going to overpower the recessive allele, which is our next term. A recessive allele is an allele whose trait is masked by the presence of a dominant allele. And so you can only see the recessive trait if you have two alleles for it. So if you look at that Punnett square in the bottom right corner, you can see that we have a homozygous dominant, two heterozygous, and then that green circle, we would call that homozygous recessive. They have two alleles that are both lowercase. That's the only one out of these four that would show the recessive trait, because you have to have two recessive alleles in order to show it. okay? Number 9 is a hybrid. A hybrid, kind of think of this as like the opposite of a purebred. A hybrid is an organism with 2 different alleles for a trait. It is heterozygous for that trait. So again, if you look at that Punnett square in the bottom right, the ones at the bottom left corner and the top right corner, the ones that have a capital letter and a lowercase letter, we would call those hybrids, okay? Think about like a hybrid car. It uses electricity and gas. It has the word "and" in there. That's kind of what is going on here. They have the dominant allele and the recessive allele. They have one of both. Okay, that's a hybrid. Okay, let's keep it going. So 10 is probability. Probability is the likelihood of a particular event occurring. And when we're doing these Punnett squares, that's what we're dealing with as probability, okay? So the next term, number 11, is a Punnett square. A Punnett square is a chart that displays all possible allele combinations resulting from a genetic cross. And we're gonna do some practices on Punnett squares as this unit continues. So just hang in there with me and we'll get some examples, okay? So the next one here, 12, is phenotype. A phenotype is an organism's observable physical appearance or traits. So phenotype, to figure out someone's phenotype, all you have to do is look at them. Because if you look at them, you can see their physical appearance. That person might be tall or have dark skin or have dark hair. All of those things that you can see is called the phenotype. And how I remember this is phenotype and physical both have that same start of the word, right? That PH. So the phenotype is the physical appearance. I used to always ask this question in my biology class and it was always missed a lot for some reason. The question would go like, how could you determine the phenotype of your dog? And the answers would always be like, oh, I would cross it, I would do this, I would do all these scientific experiments. No, to find the phenotype of something, you just have to look at it. If you can look at the animal, you know what its phenotype is. Okay, now phenotype kind of goes along with this next term. 13 is the genotype. A genotype is an organism's genetic composition or allele combination. So like, let's look at this picture in the bottom corner here. Okay, this first one right here on the far left, talking about the normal wings, this individual has a capital W, 2 capital W's. So these, the letters, the alleles would be known as the genotype. But to figure out its phenotype, you just look at it. And the phenotype here is normal wings. Now, this is something that I kind of want to talk about. When we compare the phenotype of a homozygous dominant and a heterozygous individual, they'll be the same. Both of these individuals have normal wings, so their phenotype is the same, but their genotypes are different. This one is big W, and this one is big W, little w. So this is a heterozygous, this is a homozygous dominant. Their genotypes are different, the alleles that they have are different, but the phenotype is the same, okay? So the genotype determines your phenotype. Okay, let's keep it going. I've got 14 and 15 here. 14 is homozygous. Homozygous are individuals having 2 identical alleles for a trait. Okay, and we would usually say homozygous dominant for having 2 capital letters or homozygous recessive for having 2 lowercase letters. Okay, 15 is heterozygous. Heterozygous means having 2 different alleles for a trait. So you might have 1 capital and 1 lowercase letter. Okay, so real quick, just to kind of talk about these 2 words, the prefix homo and homozygous here, homo means the same. And so these individuals have the same alleles. They could be 2 capital letters or 2 lowercase letters. Okay, hetero, and this word heterozygous means different. And so what's going on here is they have 2 different alleles. It's always going to be 1 capital and 1 lowercase letter. Okay, so hetero means different, homo means the same, and that's kind of talking about their genes. Okay, so let's keep it going. Just kind of wanted to use these words so you can kind of wrap your head around them a little bit more. This is kind of an introduction to genetics and how to use these vocabulary words. Okay, so genetics is the branch of biology that focuses on heredity and variation in organisms. Okay, let's remember that chromosomes carry hereditary information in the form of genes. And remember, genes are encoded by the arrangement of nucleotides in the DNA. Okay, so depending on what combination of nucleotides you get in what order, that's going to determine your genes, and then your genes determine your physical traits. Okay, we'll talk more about this last bullet point in our next unit, but what's going on here, genetic information flows in a particular way. Okay, it flows in the form of DNA to RNA to proteins. And what that means is that we use our DNA, we make a copy of it using RNA, and then the copy that we have, the RNA, is used to make proteins, which will ultimately, decide your physical appearance. Okay, so DNA to RNA to protein. We'll talk more about this information a lot more next unit. I just kind of wanted to introduce it right now. Okay, let's keep it going. So chromosomes and genes come in pairs. Remember, you'll have 2 alleles for a certain trait. Okay, those homologous chromosomes, remember homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that are similar in shape and size and carry the same types of genes, okay? And new gene combinations arise through sexual reproduction. If you think back to our last unit, we talked a lot about meiosis and how we shuffle the deck when it comes to genetic combination. So we do that thing called crossing over, and also all of these genes are being sorted independently. So that's going to increase our genetic variation, which is a good thing, okay? And then lastly here, fertilization involves the union of 2 gametes, 1 from each parent, okay? So here's some more terms you need to know, okay? A gene, remember that that's the unit of heredity, okay? A new term that we haven't seen yet is this next bullet point, a genome. A genome is the complete set of genes in an organism. And a really great example of this is the Human Genome Project. This was like the late 90s. We wanted to take a human and find out all of the genes for a human. They thought this was going to take years and years and like decades, and they figured it out in just like 3 or 4 years. Okay, but today, now we know the full human genome, which means we know all the complete set of genes for a human. Okay, let's keep this going. So alleles, we've seen this before. Remember that alleles, these are different forms of a gene that occupy the same position on homologous chromosomes and determine the same trait. And the example I used earlier is that they're like different flavors of a trait. Okay, here's another term, so locus. Locus is the location, okay? It's the specific location on a DNA strand where a gene or its allele is found. To me, locus and location kind of sound alike, so if you're looking for a gene, you have to know its locus, which means you would know its location on the DNA strand, okay? Couple more terms here. So let's compare genotype versus phenotype. Remember that phenotype is the physical appearance. You know someone's phenotype just by looking at them. The genotype is much harder to figure out. It's the genetic makeup of an organism. And this is when you're going to have to do some kind of experiment or do a test cross to determine someone's genotype. But phenotype can be determined just by looking at them. Okay? What we're going to get started in the next unit is something called a monohybrid cross. A monohybrid cross is a genetic cross involving a single pair of genes. It's one trait, and parents differ by only one trait. Okay, so a monohybrid cross, this is like a regular Punnett square that has those 4 cells. Later on in this unit, we'll do something called a dihybrid cross, which is when you're tracking 2 genes instead of just 1. Okay, and then lastly, here are different types of generations. So the P generation is the original set of parents in a genetic cross, and then the F1, it stands for first filial generation, which means like family, but I just like to think of it as offspring. So the F1 generation, that's the offspring that results from a cross between the P generation, and then the F2 generation is the offspring resulting from a cross between the F1 generation. And then if we had another one, it would just be F3. So you just add one more number to it, and that would be the 3rd generation, okay? So y'all, I just kind of want to introduce some of these terms with y'all. I've got some review practice that we're going to try. So what I'd like for you to do, teacher, if you could go ahead, take that, it's 15 vocabulary terms. If you could go ahead and pass that out to everybody, y'all take 5 or 10 minutes to work on it, however long you need, and then when you're ready for the review, y'all can come back to me and I'll do it on the board up here. Okay, so go ahead, pause the video, pass that out, y'all work on it, and then when you're ready, come back to me and I'll do it on the board up here. All right, I know this didn't give y'all any problem, but just in case somebody's a little confused, let's go ahead and review it together. Y'all feel free to change or add anything you don't have, and that way you can take this home and study it on your off time in case you need a little bit of extra help. So let's go ahead and see what y'all came up with for this one. All right, so I've got 15 questions here. These are vocabulary terms that we were just talking about. Number 1 says, an allele whose trait is expressed in the organism whenever it is present. This is saying that if you have this allele, you're going to show it regardless of what those other alleles are. Y'all might remember that that's called a dominant trait. So let's go with letter B. Okay, if you have a dominant allele, you're going to see it. Okay, the next one says a chart that displays possible allele combinations resulting from a genetic cross. So this is the one, it has 4 squares in it. What is that called? Y'all might remember that that's called a Punnett square. So let's go with letter M, and this shows probability for the offspring. Okay, number 3 says the transmission of traits from parent to offspring. Okay, so what do we think this one could be? I'm going to go with letter G. This is heredity. Okay, heredity is the transmission of traits from parent to offspring. Okay, let's keep it going. 4 says having 2 identical alleles for a trait. Okay, what's a prefix we've been using in this class that means the same? Y'all might remember that homo means the same. So having 2 identical alleles is called being homozygous. All right, so for number 4, let's go with J, homozygous. Okay. The next one, 5, the complete set of genes in an organism. Okay, this one is genome. So for number 5, let's go with letter E, genome. Okay, great work. All right, 6 says the different versions of a gene. And again, another way to say this is like different flavors of a trait. Which one of those is different flavors? Let's go with letter A, allele. So again, examples of this would be red hair versus brown hair. They're both coding for the same trait, but they're different versions. So those would be alleles. All right, 7 says an organism's genetic combination or allele combination. Okay, so this one for number 7, let's go with F. Okay, and this is going to be genotype. Okay, your genotype is the gene composition. Okay, what alleles do you have? That's genotype. All right, number 8 is chromosomes that are similar and they carry the same type of genes. Okay, what are the chromosomes that are very similar? Well, just like we talked about earlier, homo means the same, so homozygous. Here we want to use the term homologous chromosomes. So for number 8, let's go with I here. Homologous chromosomes are those similar chromosomes that carry the same type of genes. All right, 9. This says a characteristic that an organism can pass on to its offspring through its genes. Okay, so what's that? What do your parents pass on to you? We call these traits, and traits are things that you can see. So for number 9, let's go with O. Okay, great work. All right, let's keep it going. We're mostly through this. I just got a couple more. Let me scroll down a little bit so you can see them. All right, 10 says the specific location on a DNA strand where a gene or its allele is found. So which of these words kind of sounds like location? For number 10, let's go with K, and that's locus. Okay, locus, location, they kind of sound alike to me. All right, here's the next one. 11 says a segment of DNA on a chromosome that encodes for a specific trait. Okay, so for 11, I want to go with C. And this is gene. Okay, so a gene codes for a trait. A gene is on the DNA, and if you know where that gene is, then you would have its locus. Okay, so let's keep this going. 12 says an organism's observable physical appearance or traits. So the physical appearance, this is going to be phenotype, L. Okay, so remember that your genotype, your allele combinations dictates or controls your phenotype, which is what you look like. Okay, so having brown eyes and dark hair, that would be considered someone's phenotype. All right, keep it going. 13 says having 2 different alleles for a trait. So having 2 different alleles for a trait, different is hetero. So we want to go with heterozygous here, okay? So 13 is going to be H, okay? H for that one. All right, 14, this has an allele whose trait is masked by the presence of a dominant allele. So this is the recessive allele. This is letter N. If you have one dominant allele, it's going to show, but if you have two of the recessive ones, there's nothing to mask it, and so having two of the recessive alleles is the only time that you'll see the recessive trait. Okay, and then lastly, 15 says the scientific study of heredity. This is letter D, which is genetics. Genetics studies heredity. Okay, so I wanted to make sure we kind of got these terms under our belt before we started doing more complicated stuff. Hopefully that was helpful to y'all. Thank y'all so much for following along. Your teacher has some other work for you to practice on, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.